Good evening, everybody, and thank you for joining us. My name is Daniel Horan. I'm a Franciscan friar, and here at St. Mary's College in Notre Dame, Indiana, I am professor of philosophy, religious studies, and theology, and I have the privilege of serving as the director of the Center for the Study of Spirituality here. I am delighted to welcome you to this special Ex Libris author lecture event with Father James Martin, our esteemed guest here. But before introducing our guest in a formal way, I want to take a moment to say a word about the center. Founded in 1984 by Dr. Keith Egan with generous support from the Sisters of the Holy Cross, the Center for the Study of Spirituality offers programs that promote the engagement between faith and reason and the connection between mind, body, and spirit. A hub for scholarly and public engagement, we draw on intellectual resources in the Catholic and broader Christian heritage, as well as how individuals practice faith in their daily lives to develop critical conversations around contemporary religious issues, especially as they relate to women's experiences in society, the academy, and the church. The format for our program this evening is threefold. First, Father Jim will offer a brief presentation about his work, about his latest book. I'll say more about that in just a moment. Next, he and I are going to engage in a bit of an informal conversation about the book. And finally, we're going to open up the floor, as it were, virtually for you to ask questions and to offer your comments. And to do that, I want to direct your attention to the bottom of your webinar screen. You'll see this Q&A button. So if you would, as we're talking and as Father Martin is talking about his book, if a question comes to mind or a comment you'd like to share, please click that and enter it into that button, and we'll take these questions as they come in. So thank you for that. We also want to say that although this is a virtual event and we don't have the opportunity to have books available for sale in person, we will be posting a link. In fact, I'll do that right now into the chat so that you can learn more about how to find Father Martin's book through the publisher. You can purchase directly from HarperCollins or any place, basically anywhere you can find books. And if they don't have this book this week, demand it. You should get it soon. So it's now my privilege to introduce our guest this evening. The Reverend James Martin, S.J., is a Jesuit priest, editor-at-large at America Magazine, consultor to the Vatican's Dicastery for Communication, and the author of numerous books, including several New York Times bestsellers. And as an aside, we need to add a fourth bestseller, which is this book, so buy that book this week. I feel like this is very anti-Franciscan of me to be so capitalistic, but it's a good book, you'll see. The three previous bestsellers include Jesus, a Pilgrimage, The Jesuit Guide to Almost Everything, and My Life with the Saints, which Publishers Weekly named one of the best books of 2006. And I'll add, too, that it's actually one of my favorite of Father Jim's books. If you haven't read that, buy this book and then go read that one. Father Martin is a frequent commentator in the national and international media. He's appeared on all major networks, including MSNBC earlier this week. And he has appeared in such diverse outlets as the Colbert Report, NPR's Fresh Air, and in the opinion pages of the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal. He has received dozens of awards and recognitions, including more than 20 honorary degrees from a range of universities. He has also recently been named a participant in the Synod on Synodality by Pope Francis himself. And before entering the Jesuits in 1988, he graduated from the Wharton School of Business. So if you have any MBA-esque questions, be sure to save those for the end. I also want to add that I've had the privilege of knowing Father Jim and working with him for many years, and I'm honored to call him a friend and a colleague. I was thinking in anticipation of this evening, Jim, that my first interactions with you involved a voicemail you left for me when I was a novice Franciscan, because Jim Martin, Father Jim, was my editor at America Magazine in the very first piece I ever had published there in 2007. So I think the call was in 2006, and it took a while for it to go through production, but anyways, it's a long journey, a great journey, and a good journey, and we're so glad to have you here. So on behalf of St. Mary's College and all of those who are joining us this evening, we send you a warm virtual welcome to our campus and community.
Well, thanks, Dan. And Dan's going to call me Jim, and I'm going to call him Dan. And if we seem a little too informal, it's because we are good friends. And so it's not that we don't respect one another. We're very good friends and tease each other a lot. I'm very grateful to be here. I'm grateful to Dan and to the center for inviting me. Thank you also for allowing me to do this virtually. It's been a busy week with this book launch, and you also saved me 2 or 3 days of travel. And, Laudato Si wise, we have reduced the carbon footprint. So I'm really happy to be here. I'm a great fan of the center, great fan of Dan, great fan of the Holy Cross priests, brothers and sisters, and just really happy to be with all of you. And thanks for tuning in. I think it'll be a fun night. As Dan said, I'm going to talk a little bit first about the book, kind of an overview of the book. Here it is, Come Forth. I will probably mention the title a few times. And then Dan and I are going to go into a little conversation. Let me just change things so I can see people. There we go. So Dan and I were talking earlier about just the whole concept of Lazarus. And my mother, in her inimitable way, as mothers often do, said, "Lazarus? Why Lazarus? A whole book on Lazarus?" And the answer to that question is a little takes a little bit of going back. When I was a young person, when I was a teenager in 1977, I would have been 16. I saw on television, which some of you of a certain age, as the French say, may remember, the miniseries Jesus of Nazareth by Franco Zeffirelli. It's on YouTube if those young people want to see it. I just showed it to a young woman, Molly Cahill, who works at our office at America. She's 25, and she said, "Oh my gosh, I've never seen this," and she really liked the scene I showed her. The scene of the raising of Lazarus, which was tremendously dramatic, with Jesus calling, "Come forth," and Lazarus coming out of the tomb, made a huge impression on me as a teenager. Believe it or not, more so than the resurrection of Jesus Christ. And it just imprinted itself on me. It just raised all sorts of questions. Who is this guy, right? Did Jesus raise anyone else from the dead? Who are Martha and Mary to talk to him like that? What's going on with the story? Why did Jesus wait? So it really captivated me in a way that just stuck with me. Fast forward about 30 years. My first time in the Holy Land, I was researching a book called Jesus, a Pilgrimage, which Dan mentioned. And the person who was helping me plan the trip, a fellow named, Drew Christensen, former editor-in-chief of America, was laying out all the places that I could go. And he said, "You really have to go to the Holy Land to understand Jesus." So we went. I had a wonderful time. When I was in Jerusalem, the head of the Pontifical Biblical Institute there said, "Well, of course you can visit Bethany." I said, "I can." Do they know where that is? I mean, my knowledge of the Holy Land was pretty limited. He said, "Yeah, and you can visit Lazarus's tomb." I said, "What? How is that possible?" So I took a bus ride, and not many people go there. I mean, they have some groups that visit there, but because it's in Palestinian territory, it's a little more difficult to get to. And so I went down into the tomb. It's a long, kind of slippery staircase that I talk a lot about in the book. Maybe some of you have been there. I have pictures of it in the book. And when I was there, I just imagined myself sort of leaving behind anything that would kind of keep me free, keep me unfree, keep me bound, sort of keep me sort of from following God more nearly, more closely. And then I sort of imagine kind of leaving it in the tomb, letting something die and hearing God call me into new life. And it just really made an impression on me. And I started thinking more and more about Lazarus, doing some research into the story. And then when I started to lead pilgrimages, maybe 2 or 3 years later, I think that's about right, we would bring pilgrims to Bethany. By the way, Bethany, current day Bethany, is called, which I continually think is so beautiful. The name of the town, which is the title of the first chapter of my book, is, I'll show you what it looks like in case you don't understand me, is Al-Azariah. Al-Azariah, and that's the first chapter in the book, Al-Azariah. And there's a little picture of pilgrims standing outside of the tomb of Lazarus. Al-Azariah means the place of Lazarus in Arabic. So when I would bring pilgrims, I would sort of ask them to do, or invite them to do, the same meditation. Imagine the kinds of things that are kind of keeping you bound, keeping you unfree, right? Leave them in the tomb and come out. And people sometimes came out crying. Now, I don't know if this is a common meditation in Lazarus's tomb, but it was one that really worked for pilgrims. So I started to think, maybe I'll write about this. I finished Jesus, a Pilgrimage. I had finished my book, Learning to Pray, and I just thought, I really love this story. My model, which you'll laugh about because it's so much shorter than this book, was Henry Nouwen's The Return of the Prodigal Son. So for many of you who may not know, Henry Nouwen was a Dutch Catholic priest who wrote a book on that parable, the parable of the prodigal son, tongue twister, and sort of expanded it into a book and sort of reflected on it piece by piece. And that's what this book is sort of modeled after. It's much larger, of course, and it combines, I should say, biblical exegesis, so some sort of taking apart of the text and trying to understand what's really going on by going back to a little of the Greek. You don't have to be, by the way, a scholar. I make all this as inviting and accessible as possible. Looking at some of the sort of historical reasons for what's going on in the story. For example, in the story of Lazarus, and if you don't know it, very briefly, two sisters named Martha and Mary, who are living in Bethany, which is outside of Jerusalem, who would have been friends with Jesus, send word to Jesus that their brother is ill. They call him He Whom You Love, which is very beautiful. There's a whole chapter in that in the book. Jesus waits a couple days, very mysterious, comes to Bethany. They greet him and say, if you had been here, our brother would not have died. They take him to the tomb. He stands at the tomb, says, take away the stone, and says, Lazarus, come out or come forth. The dead man comes out, and then he says, unbind him. So it's it is often called Jesus's greatest miracle. But back to the historical stuff and the need for biblical criticism. Why does Jesus wait? Well, one theological reason is that in John's gospel, Jesus is kind of in control. He will go to Bethany when he goes to Bethany. But if you know a little bit about the history and kind of the traditions, you know that for the Jewish people at the time, the soul would have been considered to be hovering around the body for 2 or 3 days. Okay, so when you know a little bit more about that, you can say, aha, well, maybe Jesus is waiting so that he can be sure that people know that Lazarus is dead, which is what he says to the Apostle Thomas, Lazarus is dead. In other words, looking at some biblical criticism, some New Testament criticism, and by criticism, I mean commentary and scholarship, can help us understand the story. So the book is a little of that, a little of spirituality. So some of the kind of themes I was talking about, leaving behind things that are sort of keeping you unfree, experiencing freedom. A little bit of travelogue, like what is it actually like in Bethany? What's it like when you go to Al-Azariah? And also a little bit of cultural history. This is the first time I've done this in a book. The book, as I said, has lots of pictures. And one of the reasons is we trace sort of the image of Lazarus. I don't know if you can see that. The images of Lazarus through fine arts, through novels, through plays. He's everywhere. And I think it tells us a lot about how the story of Lazarus has been received. Also, legends about what happened to Lazarus after he died, which are fascinating, as you can imagine. Some people say he was in Marseille. Some people say in Cyprus. Some people say first in Cyprus, then in Marseille. So the book kind of combines all those things. But really, the overarching theme of the book is how this story can invite you to experience new life in your own life, right? And that's the answer to the question of what does Lazarus have to, what is the story from 2,000 years ago about Jesus raising from the dead have to teach us today? And it is that God calls all of us to new life. And the book helps you to kind of see your way clear into the tomb and then out of the tomb into the sunlight of God's love. So it's 7:15. I know I said I'd only talk for 15 minutes, so right on the spot. And now I'm much happier to talk with Dan than to hear me kind of rattle on.
I don't know if our audience would agree. I think the solo Jim Martin presentation might be preferred, but I'm eager to talk with you about this. You mentioned already, and I've shared that we've known each other for a while. We've been very good friends for some time, and I remember you talking about this, and I think my first reaction too was not unlike your mom's. Like why Lazarus? And so, having read the book now, and having heard you summarize it so well, so succinctly, because I'm sure you're used to that this week, especially. I can attest. There's a lot there, and I imagine there's a lot for everybody who's listening to appreciate. But I want to maybe raise a couple questions as folks in the audience are thinking about questions and comments they might have. And one of the things I really appreciate about your work generally, and in this book particularly, Jim, is that as somebody who doesn't self-identify as a scholar, you are very diligent about consulting experts. And so, it is very accessible, but there's a foundation here of biblical scholarship and theological tradition and citation, which we in the academic world very much appreciate. And there's so many really significant figures, theologians like Carl Rahner and Elizabeth Johnson, Amy Jill Levine, the late and great Father Dan Harrington, so many people who have been so influential in the field that you've gotten to know and study. So the question I have is, as you were going deeper and deeper into the tradition of Lazarus, what surprised you the most?
Well, and thanks for recognizing that. Yeah, I had what I kind of consider a sort of team of scholars, and one of the great things about working in America is that I got to know these people, and someone like you, if I need something about Franciscan spirituality, I call up Dan Horan. It's like calling up the expert, and so I like biblical scholarship to begin with, Bible commentaries. So to be able to know these people and kind of talk to them was amazing for me. And some people who I thought, oh, I'll never be able to contact this person. And there they are, and they're emailing me and answering all my questions. The most surprising, I would say a couple surprising things. The most surprising thing is the tradition, I would say the new tradition, that Lazarus may in fact be the mysterious beloved disciple of John's gospel. That kind of blew my mind. And I'll tell you a funny story, and you know this fellow. I was out to dinner with Michael Peppard. Michael Peppard is a Fordham theologian, and I find theologians, I'll often say these kinds of things. There are things that are going on in the scholarly or the academic community that are very well known, that are not well known outside. And Michael said, well, of course, and they often say it this way, of course, of the sort of discussion that Lazarus might be the beloved disciple. And I said, what? He said, oh yeah, that's and it's Ben Witherington and a couple other scholars. So the beloved disciple is this sort of source of a lot of the stories in John's gospel that many people often just equate with John himself, or whoever the writer of John's gospel is, which I don't think makes a lot of sense, because the writer of John's gospel refers to the beloved disciple as a separate person. And so I look at some of the reasons why Lazarus might be the beloved disciple. For example, and I was very surprised to find this out, the beloved disciple doesn't make an appearance until after the story of Lazarus. So it is as if Lazarus' story, remember, Lazarus is called he whom you love, the beloved one, hon philes. That's in John 11, and the beloved disciple only appears after that. Probably the hardest evidence, or the most sort of solid evidence, is in John 21 at the breakfast by the sea, when the risen Christ appears to the disciples. Long story back and forth. Do you love me? Do you love me? Says Jesus. After Peter says, yes, I love you, Peter says, which is the strangest comment, I think, in the New Testament. Peter says, well, what about him? Pointing to the beloved disciple. I often use this in retreats in terms of keep your eyes focused on God, right? Stop looking at the other person. And Jesus says, well, what business is this of yours if he should, be around until I come again? And then John's gospel says, because of this, the rumor arose that this disciple would not die. Now, that makes no sense about anyone except someone who's been raised from the dead. They wouldn't, why would a Galilean fisherman be rumored not to die? So that was the first thing. And I talk about that in the book, Lazarus as the possible beloved disciple. I think the other thing, Dan, was a kind of, and you'll know this as an academic, the debates between scholars over something you would think would be settled. So my favorite one, and I share these debates and say, look, it's up to the reader. One of the most interesting ones was Martha. So as we were saying, Jesus comes and Jesus says, I'm the resurrection and the life. Do you believe that? And she says, yes, I believe that you are the Messiah. You are the Son of God, the one who is to come. Some scholars say this is Martha's big moment. This is like Martha is like Peter saying, you are the Messiah, the Son of God. This is her crowning moment. This is her big time in the sun. Other scholars say, no, this is Martha being shown as someone who doesn't understand Jesus. Because in John's gospel, when someone says, I know, or I see, or I believe, they don't. So it's this total dichotomy. Now, look, we can't fault Martha for imperfect understanding of Jesus, but so those kinds of things were they are continually surprising. And these are like reputable mainstream scholars. It's not like here's this fringy scholar. And I just found that fascinating. And so I put it in the book and kind of leave it up to the reader. But like I said, I'm kind of a Bible nerd, so I love all that stuff.
There's another instance that comes to mind where you call her because your friend's AJ, but the renowned New Testament scholar, Amy Jill Levine from Vanderbilt University, who's got another great book, the Short Stories of Jesus. I think that's
Yeah.
one of the best books around. After, of course, Come Forth.
After, right.
Yes, but there's one narration you have of this scholarly debate where you present a scholar's view, and a number of people think this sort of interpretation of a passage, and then she just says, "No, I don't think so," and just
No,
yeah,
she just blows it. Yeah, no, that's ridiculous.
that's nuts.
The other one that I actually thought you were going to talk about, which blew me away, was so I had a couple scholars review this book, like go through it. Ben Witherington, A.J. Levine, Francis Maloney, Brendan Byrne, Michael Pepper. They not only helped me, but they reviewed it. So AJ wrote back and said, in the story of Martha and Mary in Luke's gospel, where if people don't know, Jesus visits their house, Martha complains that Mary isn't doing enough work. She said, you keep talking about the meal because it's always Martha's not helping me prepare the food. And there's every picture is a meal. And AJ said, there's no meal in that gospel. And I said, oh, yes, there is. Of course, it's ridiculous. I went back. There's no meal. What Martha is complaining about Mary not helping her with is diakonia, which is translated as ministry or service. And AJ said, we have kind of relegated her to, as she said, peeling potatoes. And she believes that the reason that we don't talk about Martha as diakonia is because that's where we get the word deacon from. So I really was brought up short. I mean, I've read that passage 5,000 times probably. I just love working with these top scholars. It's just fascinating. And they're pretty blunt too. That's the other thing. They will tell you like, no, or I won't say who, like, no, that person's wrong. I'll say, well, so-and-so's no, wrong.
Oh, so-and-so, then they're definitely wrong. That's usually how they work. Yeah.
Yeah. And so I think the key is, look, I mean, a lot of this is speculative, right? And the key is kind of offering these things in an accessible and an inviting way, right? To really help deepen person's understanding of the scripture. Because at different points I say, look, we can't get too far into the weeds, we have to understand that, this is really meant as a story for us to encounter, right, as it is.
Well, and I would say, just on this topic of what surprised you, I'm really happy to hear about Lazarus as possibly the beloved disciple in John, because I think you lay that kind of scholarly argument, but then all of the sort of pieces of the Johannine text that we take for granted, not unlike the Lucan passage of the diaconia, where I think Pope Francis talks about this often, that we feel like we're so used to, or we know the scripture really well. I think about, he's used this language, I know others in the past have as well, where they talk about domesticating the gospel. We don't let it surprise us.
Yeah.
So, we hear the beginning of a parable and we think we know the point. So we just zone out,
Right.
And so I was not aware of this, at least as many arguments as there have been presented about this possibility. And I think you do a really great job laying that out. And it's true, it's biblical interpretation. And so we all have the same text, and it'll be up to readers to say, well, no, I'd rather kind of assume that this beloved disciple who goes generally unnamed is John or somebody else. But I found myself reflecting and praying and really being struck by the possibility of Lazarus, especially the scene at the cross too. Woman, behold your son, son, behold your mother. And to think about this relationship as not just some, kind of other disciple or something like this, but Lazarus, who plays such a significant role. So,
well, now I'm realizing I've had these experiences in the last couple of days. I should have put that in the book, because you're helping me realize, I can't believe I haven't thought about this, that Jesus would have been entrusting his mother to someone he loved very much.
Yeah.
That's he whom you love. Now, of course, whoever, even if it was John the evangelist and someone, but that's another kind of argument. It is fascinating. And I think you're right. There's always something that the Bible can kind of reveal to us, right? And this is, I mean, I'm going to put a pitch in for, scholarship. I think that oftentimes Catholics, and you'll see this online, like, oh, the historical critical method or textual criticism, oh, you're just like watering things down. It actually helps us to understand it more.
Yes.
I mean, like, if you understand what's going on in these passages, what's going on historically, that the Jews believe that the soul hovered above the body, blah, 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 or would Mary and Martha have had a house, right? Does that make sense? You understand the story better. And so I think kind of diving into some of this biblical scholarship, like I said, in an accessible way, is really important for the believer, and to understand the story. But like I said, I try not to get too much in the weeds, because I know people's, tolerance for that is a bit limited.
Yeah, no, and I think the way it's delivered, it doesn't feel
Thank you.
like a boring scholarly monograph. It's really is truly accessible, and it's really well done. I want to talk about something else too, and have you reflect a little bit on something that you spend quite a bit of time in one section of the book, and it builds on this notion of scholarship and seeing the Gospels with new eyes. And I know you drew a lot from the work of Sandra Schneiders and AJ, as you call her, and other really absolutely brilliant biblical scholars. And one of the things that really struck me is the way you present and emphasize the importance of women disciples in Jesus's community. You mentioned the Martha and Mary owning a house, and how, scholars have said, well, that's not as atypical as you might think, right? These are certain ahistorical stereotypes we project back. But then one of the things you lift up, I think, really well in emphasis is that there is, a special place for women disciples in the Gospel of John, in the fourth Gospel. And so I'm thinking of a couple things here at St. Mary's College, obviously in the tradition of the Sisters of the Holy Cross, and as a women's Catholic liberal arts college, this is something that really is near and dear to our whole mission and identity. But I'm also thinking about something that you're deeply involved in, that's beginning just a few weeks from now, which is the Synod on Synodality, and how a lot of energy, a lot of discussion, a lot of enthusiasm and hope has been raised about discussions around the role of women in the church, in leadership and ministry, but just in general as well. And I wonder if you have thoughts about what the significance, and oftentimes overlooked, minimized, dismissed, misunderstood significance of the women disciples of Jesus might have for the church today.
Yeah, thanks for bringing that up. Someone asked me earlier today about why I sort of foregrounded women in this book. And, I had two answers. The first is that, I've been very influenced by scholars like, for example, Elizabeth Schussler Fiorenza. I read a book, and for those of you who don't know, she's a feminist scholar and a biblical scholar, and she wrote a book called In Memory of Her. And even the title is very profound. Jesus is talking about the woman who anoints him and says, whenever the story is told, the story will be told in memory of her. And Elizabeth Schussler Fiorenza points out, we didn't even know her name. It could be Mary, but in that passage, she goes unnamed. And it's a kind of recovery of the role of women disciples, and more broadly, women in the story. But the second answer is that it's funny, Dan. In this story, you don't have to work very hard to sort of look at the women's roles, because Martha and Mary are the ones that speak in this story. Thomas speaks. Lazarus doesn't say anything. And Martha and Mary are such strong characters. One of the things I look at is how we know they're historical, right? How do we know they're historical? One thing is we know their name. But the other thing I find really interesting is that Martha and Mary's character in John's gospel, okay, the passage we're talking about is in John 11. Martha is the active one. She rushes out and complains, Lord, if you, as I see it, a sort of a reproach, a little bit of a profession of faith, but Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died. Mary stays behind, sort of more contemplative. Mary comes out and then falls at his feet and says the same thing. In Luke's gospel, in that story that we were talking about, the characters are very similar. Martha is the active one. Mary is the contemplative one, right? Martha says to Jesus, I think the strongest words anyone says to Jesus, who's in his circle of friends or disciples, tell her to help me. That is just really, the only one that comes close, I think, is Peter on the boat at the storm at sea saying, don't you care? Don't you care that we're dying, right? And Martha says the same thing, don't you care? That is really something to say to Jesus. So what does it show? It shows that Martha is very close to Jesus because she's able to be blunt with him. She loves him. She calls him Lord, but she's blunt with him. So you have these two women who, what I love about them, their characters are really vivid. These are not just pasteboard figures. It's not just a woman. This is Martha and Mary. So I think one of the things as we look at the synod is to recover this notion of women as being full participants in Jesus's ministry. I talk a lot about that in that one chapter. Mm-hmm. Full participants, creative participants, and as Sandra Schneider says, who take original initiative, right, to do things, and they don't wait for men to tell them to do things. It's the same as Mary Magdalene. So I think that I really go back to a lot of the scholarship that I wrote, also Elizabeth Johnson, mm-hmm. to look at how their roles have been sort of buried under centuries of patriarchy. And let's just look at that story I just mentioned before, that we think of Martha as just doing kitchen work, where she was doing diaconia. I think I guess what I'm saying is it's important for me to raise up women, but I didn't really have to in this book because they're already raised up. I mean, there are Martha and Mary front and center in this story, which I just love. And by the way, when Jesus goes to their house in Luke's gospel, it's Martha's house. It's not Lazarus's house, which is also fascinating.
It really is. And I think this idea too, thinking of the synod, that there's a recovery here, or what the Vatican Council, a lot of the theologians talked about a ressourcement, right? Going back to the sources. We can do that throughout history. I was thinking, as you were talking about Martha's sort of forcefulness, which is occasioned by the intimacy with Jesus, right? As a close friend, a family friend. I couldn't help but think of the great Dominican saint, Catherine of Siena, who is, legendary for having told popes off, or even St. Clare of Assisi, the first woman to write an approved rule of religious life in the church, who refused Gregory IX. He wanted all these accommodations, and she said, I know how we're meant to live the gospel, and persisted. It's fantastic.
And then we turn them in, we kind of domesticate them. When I was on retreat, I read a biography of Mother Mary MacKillop, Saint Mary MacKillop,
from Australia, right?
Yeah, who was excommunicated by her bishop. And we tend to kind of sort of rub off these rough edges. And these were very strong women. I mean, Catherine of Siena, one of my favorite lines is she says to the Pope, "Get up and be a man." I mean, that is really strong. The other thing I wanted to say, Dan, something that I discovered, and I don't think it's in the book, but I was very surprised to find out through another scholar named Elizabeth Schrader, who does a lot of work on Martha and Mary Magdalene. This blew me away too. Mary Magdalene is never called Mary of Magdala. She is Mary who is called Magdalene. And a lot of people say that that's more of a nickname. So it's not Mary from the town of Magdala. It's Miriam Leguminos, I think, Magdalena, whatever. So, and a lot of people think that means tower. So it's like Peter the Rock, Mary the Tower, which I also find fascinating. And I said, oh, that's ridiculous. Of course she's called Mary of Magdala. No, she's not. So you're right. The word recovery is really important. And as we move towards the synod, ressourcement is very important. It's all there.
It is. It really is. So I'm going to bring up a section, a theme that you address, and I was hoping you would address it differently. So this isn't necessarily a scholarly debate, but I want to hear more about your take, because I wish the section of the chapter was longer. And this is around, why did it take Jesus 2 days? Why did he wait? And you do, I think, a great job phrasing a lot of possible answers to the question, right? And the one that I have found myself drawn to, and I'm not a biblical scholar, I'm a systematician and a scholar of spirituality, but I'm not a biblical scholar. So I will also stipulate that. But I have found myself in recent years thinking about this passage, in particular because of a project I was working on around fear and spirituality, about Jesus. And you do talk about the context, right? And the scholars point this out. And oftentimes we in the congregation, hearing the gospel story proclaimed, get little snippets, so we don't have the whole context. And the key thing is, Jesus and his disciples just left the area of Jerusalem, basically under threat of execution. And they get word about this. And then there's this kind of hemming and hawing and this kind of back and forth with the disciples. And I think you present that really well. My sense is that you kind of decide to go with the control in John as one of the things that, there's a couple possibilities, but I want to hear more. I would just propose what I have viewed that as is really the human part, humanness of Jesus, his humanity in a state of fear. This fear.
Well, that's there. That should have been the fourth possibility. That's a great that's once again, I after I write the book, you tend to learn things. The other thing, or maybe he didn't want to bring the disciples,
Yeah.
But it's funny, John Deere in his book points out that they say, let us go to Bethany, and then they're not there. Which
Yeah.
is pretty funny. But this is like what a close reading will do, because Thomas says, let us die with him. He's very kind of big, about it. And then Jesus gets to Bethany and there's no sign of the disciples. So yeah, I mean, so the possibilities are, and if people don't remember the story, he waits, right? It says, your brother was our brother, he whom you love is ill. And then the line is, which is actually very funny in the Greek. I have the passage at the front of the book, because one of the things I said to the publishers, I have to have this whole passage in the book. I don't want people running back and forth to their Bible. But it says, let's see if I can find it. Here it is. I love this. Accordingly, though Jesus loved Martha and her sister and Lazarus, after having heard that Lazarus was ill, he stayed 2 days longer in the place where he was. So it's just like, even though he loved them, he stayed 2 days longer. So the typical answers for that are this. There's a theological answer, which you alluded to, which is that in John's gospel, Jesus is always in control. On the cross, he gives up his soul. He's in control. And he will go to Bethany when he goes to Bethany, right? So there's a sense of like, I am who I am, right? The second sort of possibility is that he knows that he will give Lazarus something better than healing, right? So he's not just going to heal him. So it's a kind of, I know better than you do. I think the third possibility could be your possibility, that there's a human Jesus. I would say, however, I think that's less likely in John because he's so, in control. Although in reality, that may have been, part of his, to kind of steel himself up.
Except I will just add, and you have a section as well in the book about this, that it's also only in John that we have the so-called shortest verse in the Bible, where Jesus weeps, and you have a similar sort of, survey of the scholarship, because again, this is somewhat inexplicable to people who see the high Christology of John. What is this? Is he weeping? Some people say because he's angry, or he's weeping because he's sad, or maybe he's weeping because he's feels a sense maybe of guilt. He should have come sooner. Maybe he's weeping just because of the emotion of.
Now that's another interesting, I never thought of, because of guilt, who knows? And I mean, certainly I believe that he did weep, because I mean, this is not something that John would put in there, to kind of make us feel different about Jesus. But Dan Harrington used to say this is not something they would add if they're trying to have this particular effect, right? So it's what's called sometimes the criterion of embarrassment. If it looks embarrassing, it's probably accurate. But I actually think that, I think it's actually the fourth reason, which is that, as I said, the belief was at the time that the soul would hover around the body. And here's my speculation. So in the story of the raising of Jairus's daughter in the Synoptic Gospels, Jesus raises a little girl, the synagogue official Jairus in Capernaum. And everyone, now, Dan, this is more kind of speculative. Everyone says, oh, she's asleep. And Jesus comes either after she's just died or is sick, or it's a little vague. So there could be a little bit of a, like, oh, he didn't really raise that person from the dead. And then the second raising is the son of the widow of Nain. He's on the funeral procession. He's not really in the tomb yet. And you could say, okay. I think the line that I always go back to is what Jesus says to Thomas: Lazarus is dead. And I think my sense is that he waits. He knows Lazarus is dead somehow. He waits because of this 3 or 4 day waiting period, so that when they go there, there's going to be no mistake about what he's doing. That's my sense. I may be wrong, and it may be a little out of fear, or maybe fear for the disciples, but my sense is that he's waiting because I think part of it is we have to understand Jesus when he does these signs in John's gospel as intending them. Do you know what I mean? As knowing the import that they're going to have. When he stills the sea, he knows he's kind of equating himself with God who calms the waters in Genesis, right? When he multiplies the loaves and the fishes, he's the bread of life. He is abundance. So my sense is that there is an intentionality that we see in Jesus, particularly in John's gospel. So that's my sense. He does this in a sense on purpose. But who knows? I mean, these are one of the many questions I want to ask Jesus. Many questions I have for Jesus if I get to heaven. Many.
Well, and I was just going to say that this is something that you bring up, throughout the book too. Two things really. One is how we began, which is people think, oh, Lazarus, okay, that's a one and done short story. We know the story, it's over. And yet the more you kind of probe this, the more it invites reflection, the more the Holy Spirit, directs us into seeing the sensus plenior, as scripture scholars say, right? The deeper meaning, the fuller meaning. I have a couple more questions for you. I have a lot.
Sure, this is great. This is so much fun.
But I want to encourage also at the same time for those in the audience to continue sending your comments and questions to the Q&A button. I'm going to switch gears just a little bit here and ask two more things, and then we'll go to the questions here.
Sure. Group. These are great. These are great questions. I love talking about this.
Yeah.
I can talk about Lazarus. I can talk about Lazarus for about 10 hours. So.
Well, I want to move just a little bit like you do in your book. So there is a lot about Lazarus, and people, as you gather from listening to us just now, you will learn a lot. There's a lot more to gain, and you have a great annotated bibliography at the end of the book for folks to go even deeper if they'd like. But one of the things that I think is really fascinating about the book is the so what, or the why question, right? It's one thing to know the stories, to know the history. It's another thing to say, well, what does this mean for me? And so I would say, I don't know if it's exactly right, but maybe the second half of the book is more of this sort of exploration, the spiritual reflection. And one of the things you bring up, and we've talked about this over the years, I have very distinct memories of conversations with you about one of the things you bring up very directly in the book. And this is around what you call at one point, the section is called Freedom from the Need to be Liked. And I think a lot of our viewers would be interested too. They may know you and know of all the great work you do, the great writing, speaking, advocacy, ministry, but they may also be aware of the criticism and the hate mail and the trolling that goes on, just like the Holy Father has, just like Pope Francis, good company. But I was really struck by how honest you were in the sharing of what that experience has been like as somebody who is a very public figure. And who is, doing the work of the gospel as you understand it, and are affirmed both by the Society of Jesus, your community, as well as the church and the Pope himself, as we've discussed. So I wonder if you can, for our viewers, just maybe share a little bit about that section of the book and how it relates to Lazarus.
Yeah, sure. So, I talk about things that the so what is all of us are called to let go of things and leave them behind in the tomb. As I said, that's the theme of the book. And I return to that in different ways and using different passages to really encourage people to be honest about, I'm Dan, I'm sure you have things that you want to let go of that are unfreedoms. And one of the biggest ones for me in my life, and I think it's not that unusual, is this need or this desire to be, as I say, loved, liked, or approved of, which we get in elementary school or junior high school. I always go back to junior high school. I want to be cool. I want people to think I'm cool, blah, blah, blah. And I think for me, though, it was pretty strong. I really admired people who could just say what they want, be who they are, right? And not really care too much about people not liking them. So I talk about the need to let go of that. And, one of the things that happened to me was that, a little bit before I was getting all this hatred because of this LGBTQ work. And I talk about this in the book. There was a guy in my community who just despised me. And I went into a retreat, and the retreat director asked me to pray over the rejection at Nazareth, right, where Jesus is rejected by his hometown. And I'm sure you've heard a million homilies like this. It's, they didn't understand it because he was too familiar. How often do we also miss God because God is, you're smiling because you've heard a million of these homilies. And that's a legit, what's that?
I said I preached it on Monday. It was the gospel reading on Monday.
And that's a legitimate way of looking at the story. But in this retreat, I remember looking at it from Jesus's point of view and thinking, well, how did you knew what they were going to say. You had been in Nazareth for 30 years. Nazareth, as I knew from my book, Jesus, a Pilgrimage, was 200 to 400 people. It's tiny. Nazareth, we have 192 participants. That's Nazareth, right? So he knew everybody. And the answer that seemed to come to me in prayer is Jesus asking me, does everyone have to like you? And it was an initial move to kind of letting go of that need to be liked and being a little free of the need, even among this. There was one Jesuit in my community who really didn't like me. even within, my community, right, in my house. But it really came to the fore in 2016 when I started to do this LGBT work. And then really when I published this book, Building a Bridge. And as you know, Dan, and we've talked about this, many people online just hate me. And I mean, hate me. And I get death threats, and people send me the vilest, meanest, sort of most violent emails. And I think one of the things that surprised me was I think God was kind of preparing me for this. And now it doesn't bother me. It really, sometimes it does bother me, but, I see people online, I say, okay, whatever, right? So that's something that I needed to leave in the tomb. And I guess the point is, the so what is we all have things like that in our lives. If it's not the need to be liked, maybe it's the need to be right all the time. Maybe it's the need to look good physically. Maybe it is the need to, whatever, to make a lot of money or to whatever, there are what Ignatius called, first time I've mentioned Ignatius, I hope you're proud of me, disordered attachments, things that we're attached to that are really not ordered right. And so that is really the so what of the book, that just as Lazarus heard Jesus say, leave behind death in the tomb and come out, right? Lazarus has to listen. We are also invited to do that. And one of the things I say in the book, which I think is really important, is that it would be enough for us to kind of recognize that in therapy or as an insight or with a friend, right? Like you realize this. But what makes it more powerful is knowing that this is God who's calling you, that God himself or herself is calling you into this new life. And so that gives you a lot of confidence. So I use that story not because it's, not because I'm sort of like catatonic and I can't get out of bed if people didn't like me, but just that here's my example of an unfreedom, and I think it's important to be honest with that stuff, because as I said, someone like Henry Nouwen, Thomas Merton, Kathleen Norris, Joyce Rupp, a lot of my favorite spiritual writers, I think it's okay to be honest with people and to say this is something I struggled with, because I think it helps to let people in their own lives say this is what I struggle with, so yeah. Little humanity is okay from time to time.
It really is. I'm keeping an eye on the time, and we've got a number of really great questions and comments. So I'm going to turn to that. But the other question, I'm just going to leave it out there as maybe an enticement for folks to pick up the book. I really was moved by the section in the book where you revisit another conversation with our mutual friend Michael Peppard and his spouse Rebecca, and how she shared her kind of really being attracted to this notion of the rotting things, the stench of Lazarus's dead corpse being brought back to life. And I think there's maybe something tied there as well to the letting go that we were just talking about. I'll just also add too, because I don't know if I've ever shared this with you, but I was very touched by the very brief anecdote of your late brother, Rick Curry, a Jesuit, who had a disability, had one arm, had lost an arm very young, was actually an actor, a television actor before joining the society. And he and I were classmates actually at Washington Theological Union.
Really?
Went back for ordination. Yeah.
Had you known that story that I told in the book?
I didn't know that story. No.
Yeah. So maybe, I'd love to. So Rick Curry, as Dan was saying, was born without a right arm. He was very funny. He founded the National Theater Workshop for the Handicapped, NTWH, National. Yeah. Anyway, long story short, when he was young, the arm, so think he's missing a right arm. The arm of St. Francis Xavier, which is actually now in the Jesuit church, the arm that baptized all these people, was making a tour. All Catholics will know this. Was making a tour of the United States, and all of his classmates said, "Oh, Ricky, you have to go for a miracle." He was in Catholic school, and he went, and imagine, and of course, I think even more detail. He told me that the people like pushed aside, like, "Oh my God, here's this kid with one arm, and now here's Francis Xavier's arm," and he prayed for a miracle. So he used to tell the story all the time, and nothing happened, or at least nothing physical happened. And he went back home, and his sister Denise, who turned out to be a nun, was hiding behind the curtains and looked at him and said, "Oh, I'm so happy. I like you just the way you are." She didn't want him to change. And I just found that so profound. And I use it as a way to sort of help people understand, God's loving them the way that they are, because the other theme of that chapter is not enoughness. People who don't feel like they're enough. which we also have to leave behind in the tomb. So we all struggle with not enoughness.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for that. And thanks for, mentioning Rick in your book and bringing his memory back to me as well.
He was also, as you know, he was also very funny too.
Very funny.
Can I tell you a very quick Rick Curry story?
Sure.
Because he was very funny. One day he was telling a story at some public event, and everybody got a big laugh. And another Jesuit said to him, "Actually, that's not the way it happened." And Rick said, "Well, you tell it the way you remember. You see if you get as big of a laugh as I did."
That's a very religious life sort of conversation. Well, we have got a lot of great questions and comments coming in. One, I just want to share first this one comment from Mary, who says that she just wants to say that just as Father James has expanded the church by his work with the LGBTQ community, his new book expands our thoughts about Lazarus as the beloved disciple. Thank you for this great Zoom. So
nice. Thank you so much. And by the way, I know we have a lot of questions. I'm happy to go a little over if you wish.
Yeah, that's okay with our viewers. Maybe we can go 10 more minutes.
Yeah, sure.
So somebody here who is looks like an alum of the JSTB out in Berkeley and said that you spoke at their graduation in 2000. This person named Terry is asking this question about if you can say a little bit more about the friendship among Martha, Mary, Lazarus, and Jesus. They're obviously very close friends. Can you say more about that?
Yeah, sure. So how do we know that they're close friends? Well, one reason is that first of all, that Lazarus is called he whom you love, hon file. So that's one thing. The second thing is we know that their house was a way station for Jesus. Interestingly, Gerhard Lofink, the scripture scholar, his wonderful book Jesus of Nazareth, said he distinguishes between disciples and friends. He said they're friends, they're more friends. So Jesus would have spent time in Mary and Martha's house. Again, Martha is very blunt with him, and I think that sort of we're only blunt with people that we're comfortable with. I mean, imagine you would never say that to your boss, right? Or imagine me saying to the Pope, "Hey, tell Cardinal so-and-so to do this." There is no way I would say that to the Pope. I might want to say something to the Pope, but so we have a sense of their intimacy. I also, one of the things I point out, which I really love, and this is, I think, an insight from Augustine and a couple other scholars, is that, and this is to the question, when the sisters send word to Jesus that their brother is ill, as I've said, they don't call him Lazarus, your disciple. They don't call him Lazarus, our brother. They don't call him Lazarus of Bethany. That would be the most New Testament thing. Lazarus of Bethany is ill. They call him, as we've said many times, he whom you love. And that's all they say. They don't say, "Come." They say, "He whom you love is ill." It is enough that they ask, I think Augustine says, which is so beautiful. And I often think kind of an interesting lesson for prayer can we just tell God? I mean, we don't always have to do that. Can we just tell God what's going on and trust that God's going to answer us? That's what a good friend does. Like imagine, God forbid you're in a situation and you call your friend and you say, "My father's in the hospital, just you leave," and they come, so it's a real intimate friendship. And I spend a lot of time in the book on the place of friendship in the spiritual life, because I think that's undervalued. I think we're all supposed to be good disciples of Jesus. We're supposed to be charitable to one another. We're supposed to be helping one another. But the ministry and the sort of apostolate of friendship, and I give a couple examples in there of how people were, good friends to me, is I think undervalued. And so to see Martha, Mary, and Lazarus as friends is really important, maybe almost as important as disciples. After all, Jesus says, "I don't call you disciples anymore, I call you friends." He even seems to think it's kind of a higher level.
But I'm just thinking as you're sharing that too about, the significance of the scriptural witness for the role of women in the church as well, which is oftentimes you hear, well, Jesus's closest disciples were all men, and this is a reason for this exclusion or that exclusion. And yet, Mary, the Magdalene, the Tower, Martha and Mary, so many women were very close to him, closer than some of these other disciples and apostles. So
yeah, and then stayed behind during the crucifixion, and then Mary, I think Sandra Schneider talks about Mary is the anointed. Mary anoints Jesus in one of the Gospels. Her original religious initiative, I love. She she anoints him with this nard, wipes his feet with her hair. By the way, interesting kind of connection, which also sort of blew me away. So Mary in the house of Bethany anoints Jesus. Where did they get the nard? It was left over from Lazarus. Because nard is something that you anoint people with who are about to die. And of course, we see this as a kind of prophetic anointing of not only him as king, but also for his burial. Who has nard around the house? They would have. And so that's that wonderful kind of connection when you dig deeper into the story. But absolutely. I mean, I like what Phyllis Agano is a friend of mine. And when she talks about the women as deacons or the female diaconate, she talks not about the institution of it, like the sort of founding of it, but the restoration of it. Yeah. We just had Phoebe the other day in the gospel. And so yeah, it's more of a restoration and a kind of bringing them back into the picture where they were left out for so many centuries.
Absolutely. So again, so many, even with 10 extra minutes, I don't think we're gonna get into them all, but here's a really interesting question from Sister Lynn, who's a sister of St. Joseph. She writes, I've never understood why Jesus raised Lazarus. Jesus promises eternal life, not to be silly. These are her words, not to be silly, but wouldn't Lazarus have been pretty happy in the afterlife? Was Jesus being selfish, maybe in his human nature, in his grief, or was it out of love for Mary and Martha? Was Lazarus an instrument to bring others to faith, or was it some other reason? You do address this quite at length in your book. Maybe you can say a little bit about that.
Yeah, and funny enough, what's sister's first name?
Lynn.
Lynn. Funny enough, Sister Lynn or Lynn, in many of the sort of fictional accounts that I look at Lazarus and culture, one of the themes, which I think is very funny, and I read them all, poems, plays, novels, some of them are a little crazy. One of the themes is that Lazarus doesn't want to come back. Lazarus says, why did you bring me back, to this kind of world? I was happy where I was. In John's gospel, why does he do it? Well, the sisters ask him, the sisters say, come, right, and do this thing. I don't think it was a selfish thing. I think, though, that in John's gospel, he is always, and this is the only way we can understand the story through John's gospel, these are signs meant for people to believe, right? And so, I guess you could say, Lazarus is going to have to do it again, basically. And most scripture scholars, or I would say many scripture scholars, think that he's probably executed, by Jesus's opponents because he's such a sign. By the way, interestingly, little aside, Dan, Ben Witherington said to me, and I think I have this in a footnote, in John's gospel, the adulation of the crowds on Palm Sunday only makes sense in light of Lazarus. Like they would have just been, ecstatic. And so Lazarus is, in a sense, it's actually not selfish, Lynn, because if there's a death, life kind of pattern where Lazarus dies, Jesus brings him life. That leads to Jesus's death. And that's another reason why he might be crying, because he knows that this is going to precipitate his death, which leads to life. So I would say not selfish, because he has to risk when the story starts, he's on the other side of the Jordan River because he's just been threatened with stoning. We have to see the story in kind of its bigger context. He comes back kind of at risk to himself, to do this for his friend. So I think it's this great act of love. And yes, Lazarus is going to die again. But, so do we all. I think it's a really beautiful, beautiful gift. But gosh, who knows what Lazarus thought when he was coming out of the tomb, what his first words were.
Especially if he smelled that rottenness that
yeah, funny enough, there are two really beautiful novels that I refer to a lot. One is called Lazarus is Dead, and one is called The Gospel According to Lazarus. They both take Lazarus. It's fictional, and they both recreate what happened. And one of the most beautiful passages, which I just love, is in one of the novels. So of course, Lazarus dies and Jesus comes, and he says to him, Jesus says, I'm sorry I was late. And Lazarus says, late for what? I mean, because Lazarus was kind of out of it. It's so human. And I just thought, boy, that seems like it's really accurate. I mean, that sounds like a real conversation. So, but when we get up to heaven, we can ask Lazarus all these questions. I think one thing Lazarus is going to say to John the evangelist, whoever wrote the gospel, like, you could have at least put in my thank you when I came out of the tomb.
The silent beloved disciple and friend.
That's right.
There's a really great question here. I think I have one thing to contribute. I'd be curious to know if you've, in your research and in writing this, have any other additions. Jean-Marie asks, what other places in the New Testament is the phrase diakonia used? It's so interesting that it's used in reference to Martha. And when you were talking about its use with Martha, I was thinking of the synoptic account of Peter's mother-in-law.
Yeah.
Another very misunderstood passage where Jesus comes into Peter's house, heals Peter's mother-in-law. And the way that the translation often has it is she gets up and immediately serves them. But the language is this diakonia, and not kind of like an oppression of, go make Peter and Jesus a sandwich, but a kind of, what does discipleship look like after being healed by the experience of Jesus? Do you have other, Phoebe, you mentioned Phoebe, who's explicitly called a deacon. That's important in the.
Yeah, so that's the one that comes to mind, the diakonia, because we just had it, what was it, yesterday, in the Gospels, Peter's mother-in-law. And also poor Peter's mother-in-law, as soon as she's healed, she's working for them, basically. So diakonia, as Dan was saying, means ministry, service, work, whence we get the word deacon. And again, Phoebe is called, in, what is it, Romans, I think, Phoebe is called diakonos, a deacon. Now, it's funny, when you say that online, I had this happen to me yesterday. All I did was quote Paul. That's all I did. Happy Feast of St. Phoebe. Here's what Paul says. Please greet Phoebe, diakonos of the Church of Kencre or Sencre. Everyone went, oh, well, diakonos meant something different back then. It didn't mean deacon. Well, so did presbyteros, which is priest. That meant something different. But I think, as AJ said, she really kind of opened my mind that the even the connection of a woman with that word is really threatening to people. And so it is, she waited on them, or she prepared a meal. So I think, again, it's this recovery. And again, this is where biblical scholarship can be really helpful. Going back to the Greek, I use quite a bit of Greek in the book. You don't have to be a Greek scholar. I translate it all. But getting back to the original language is really helpful, because we do miss things that are kind of, as the saying goes, literally lost in translation. And it's kind of shocking. I'll tell you one thing. This is a little off the topic, but I talk about this in the book. When in the synagogue at Capernaum, which we just read 2 or 3 days ago, the demon says to Jesus, I may have my tenses wrong, T amoi kai soy, what do you have to do with us, right? Jesus at the wedding feast of Cana, this is real Bible nerdy stuff, says to Mary, same thing, T amoi, I might have that mixed up, kai soy, what have you to do with me? What's the point of that? The point of that is that the very harsh words that the demon uses to Jesus, that are really seen as harsh, who are you to me? Jesus uses at the wedding feast of Cana to his mother, by the way, never called Mary, just his mother. Why am I saying that? Not because Jesus is mean to his mother, but when you get back to the original Greek, you hear things differently, and you can sort of recover things that may be translated in a little different way. Because in the New American Bible, those two passages are translated quite differently. Who are you to me? Who are you to me is how it's translated in the New American Bible. With the demon, the exact same words Jesus to Mary is, what business is this of yours to me? It's a little different. So I think, the more we know about the original translation, the better.
Absolutely. Yeah. So this is a great subtle advertisement as well to go to theology school or ministry school.
Right. That's right.
I want to give a shout out to Jackie, who rightly reminds us. She encouraged us. She said, that she appreciates our identifying and discussing Mary, and Martha and Phoebe. But she says, let's also not forget the nameless Canaanite woman who challenges Jesus as well. And
absolutely,
really good point.
The Syrophoenician woman is, encouraging Jesus to see that his mission is larger than even he thought. Absolutely. She's one of my favorite people. But also here's the thing, also unnamed.
Yes. Yeah.
And we don't know now. Probably I often think that she came into the scene and then left, right? And the disciples would have known. But again, an unnamed woman, who, in memory of her, as Elizabeth Schulzer-Fiorenza would say.
Yeah, absolutely. So Cynthia writes, and I think this is a really great question and hasn't come up yet. She says, I'm troubled by the possibility of the link between Lazarus, who was raised, Lazarus, the beloved disciple, and the Lazarus who lay with sores at the rich man's gate. The Lazarus with sores seems greatly unlike the brother of Martha and Mary. Am I missing something here? What can we say about that?
Yeah, maybe I should have been a little clearer. So basically, you have the story of Lazarus in John's community. So what do we mean by that? The community that would have been around the beloved disciple, that would have been the audience for John's gospel. Okay, so we think about it. We have four gospel writers. Dan Harrington, my New Testament professor, used to say you should think of them as, which is a great image, literally having pieces of paper on their desk of all these different stories and all these different traditions and putting them together. Okay. So they're writing for different audiences, which is why, as I say in the book, in a chapter on how the Gospels were written, they come out a little differently. You have four different portraits of Jesus. They're writing for different audiences. Okay. So in John's Gospel, they have this tradition of the story of Lazarus, right? Lazarus, the brother of Mary and Martha, who's raised from the dead. It seems that other communities would have known this. Luke's community probably would have known, or Luke the evangelist who's writing it would have known about this tradition. Okay, why is, I think we were saying earlier, why is Lazarus not in the Synoptic Gospels? Well, because they already had stories, as we were saying, of people being raised from the dead. But Luke does know of this tradition of a man being raised from the dead, and so when he tells the parable that Jesus tells, the rich man and the poor man, he gives him a name. He gives him a name that is Lazarus. Some scripture scholars believe it is a kind of echo of, the man who rose from the dead, that maybe he thought, well, look, I'm going to give him the name Lazarus so we can have this idea of someone coming back from the dead. It's not an exact correlation, right? And certainly Luke, you are right. Luke does not say, this is Lazarus, the brother of Mary and Martha, and it was a common name. But as one scholar said, it's pretty convincing that there's a connection, because you have a story in Luke about a man called Lazarus coming back from the dead, right? So I think it's an interesting kind of connection, and that I find that fascinating. We don't know. Luke should have just pulled that from thin air. But again, this is the only parable where Jesus gives someone a proper name. Everybody else is a man, a son, a woman. Yeah. So it's just an interesting connection.
I think that's great. And with an eye to time, we've got two more maybe that we
All
can.
Right. Great.
Yeah. This question comes to us from Ronnie, who writes, were there scholars who wrote about Lazarus as you describe him earlier than the 20th century? And I'll just say, from you mentioned in your book, people like Augustine and St. John Chrysostom. Are there others that you can think of? I think the answer is yes, right?
The answer is yes. I think, though, before the 20th century, it was, more kind of spiritual, theological, homilies. I quote a lot from Augustine, St. John Chrysostom, as Dan was saying. It was more didactic. This is what we should learn from Lazarus. And beautiful, too. I mean, like the insight from Augustine of, them not really needing to kind of ask him. So beautiful stuff. But, more recently, 19th century, 20th century, with the sort of advent of the historical critical method, really kind of diving into these stories like this is a little different. That's a little more contemporary. And also, I think certainly before the Enlightenment, people would have taken these stories more or less literally, right? It would have been like, here's the word of God. This is what happened, almost as if there was like a reporter. Dan Harrington used to say there was not someone taking notes. This is an oral tradition, but back then it would have been seen as more or less literal, like, geez, this literally happened this way. So less kind of, I would say, kind of examination of the text and more kind of opening them up spiritually. But yeah, there's a lot. I mean, there was a lot I had to read. There's a lot on Lazarus, but I think the thing that would surprise me was there's not a lot written. Like Augustine, Lazarus for Augustine is one of many homilies, or for John Chrysostom, it's one of. There's not a lot of books on Lazarus.
Yeah,
like just Lazarus. There's like a monograph that I found by Brendan Byrne. But so if you go online, there's a couple, but not Lazarus, which I just found fascinating because the story is just so beautiful. So I thought, well, okay, there's a hole in the market that I can fill.
Well, speaking of assignments for book projects, this is where we'll end it. Kathy writes, I so appreciate your work on all fronts. Would you ever consider writing a book on how to read scripture, especially the New Testament? You have such a wealth of knowledge. I just do not receive this kind of depth of knowledge and wisdom on any given Sunday. Thank you.
Well, that's really nice. I mean, there is a section in here about basically how to read the Gospels. There's a section in my book, Jesus, a Pilgrimage. Um, you know, I would say, I mean, with all humility, I would say I'm not a scripture scholar, and there are so many good books that are out there. Look at Dan Harrington's book. I think it's called How to Read the Bible, which is really well done. And it's a very great introduction. I think that Catholics are sometimes afraid of the Bible, and I think they feel that they're under-equipped. And one of the things that I try to do with this book and my Jesus book is to really make these things accessible, because they should be accessible. And it's just so beautiful to open up the story and understand it in a new way. So yeah, so try Dan Harrington's How to Read the Bible, or How Catholics Read the Bible. I forget what it's called offhand, but it's there, and it's short and it's accessible.
Yeah, you can't go wrong with Dan Harrington.
Never.
So thanks for the recommendation. And thank you for taking the time to be with us here virtually at St. Mary's. I've enjoyed this conversation. I'm sure our guests here who've been joining us watching and listening have as well. I want to say, first of all, that I'm sure all of us who are gathered virtually this evening will be keeping you and all the Synod participants in prayer in the coming weeks as you get ready for the Feast of St. Francis, the official opening of the Synod on Synodality.
I never thought of that. Of course, that's right.
October 4th, yeah.
Right.
And then I will see you shortly thereafter. So for those who don't know, Jim and I are co-leading a pilgrimage to Assisi in Rome in October, and so looking forward to that. It's too late, so don't ask. You can't join us, but it's always a treat to see you and to have a conversation with you. And this evening to share that with so many people virtually. I look forward to when we catch up in person. So thank you, Jim, so much.
Well, thank you. I just want to say thanks to you, Dan. Thanks to the center. Thanks to St. Mary's. Thanks to everybody who joined us. I want to say also a little bit of a plug. It helps, especially if you buy the book in the first week, for all sorts of reasons. The book is available in print. This is the hardcover. There are plenty of lovely pictures in there. It's also an ebook, and it is also on audio. I read the book myself, however many hours. So thanks so much. Keep me in your prayers, and God bless you all. And thank you, Dan, again. It's wonderful to be with you.
Our pleasure. And let me just say, I've added a link again for folks in the chat to learn where you can purchase Father Jim's book. And I'm adding also in the chat a link to the upcoming events here at the Center for the Study of Spirituality, including on Tuesday afternoon at 5 o'clock Eastern Time. We have Dr. Rachel Wheeler joining us to talk about eco-spirituality. That's going to be a live event in person here, but it'll be live streamed as well for free. So look into that if you're interested. Everyone have a great night, and blessings to you all.
Thank you. God bless you.